Hi, my name is Elizabeth Bryan with the International Food Policy Research Institute, and I will be presenting the conceptual approach and research highlights from the Gender, Climate Change, and Nutrition Integration Initiative, or GCAN. I'll also give an overview of why gender and nutrition matter for climate resilience, and conclude with some broad research topics that we think require further exploration. The GCAN project has several objectives. One is providing advisory services. This includes responding to requests for information and support by USAID missions and other USAID staff based in DC. One example is we provided support for gender and nutrition sensitive climate risk screening to several missions. We also engage in strategic research on the integration of climate change, gender, and nutrition. Research topics are generally co-identified through engagement with the missions and other USAID staff. We also increase the use of Feed the Future datasets by harmonizing selected datasets and hosting hackathons. And we provide other research services on demand. For example, we recently explored the gendered impacts of COVID-19 through phone surveys in 7 Feed the Future countries. So why is integration of climate change, gender, and nutrition important? There are several reasons why we focus on the intersection of these three research areas. One is the need to consider who is participating in and benefiting from climate-smart agriculture in order to identify and address gendered barriers, and to ensure social inclusion and gender equity in climate-smart investments and interventions. Second, GCAN research shows that climate shocks like drought and heat stress can affect men and women in different ways, such as shifting their labor allocation. So it's important to have gender-responsive approaches to address climate change. Adoption of new climate-smart practices is also not gender neutral. If practices that are taken up don't meet women's needs, that can exacerbate gender inequality. Similarly, climate change has negative impacts on food security and nutrition, especially for vulnerable populations. And not all interventions have the same benefits for food security and nutrition, so they need to be weighed against that objective as well. To help think through how these issues of climate change, gender, and nutrition are connected, the GCAN project developed a conceptual framework to highlight the linkages. The framework shows how the outcomes of climate shocks and stressors are filtered through several elements, including the level of exposure and sensitivity to the disturbance, the existing level of resilience capacities that people have, the decision-making context which influences response choices, and the types of responses that people adopt, which then influence outcomes along several impact pathways, like changes in income or labor allocation. And all the elements in this framework are influenced by gender. For example, men and women have different capacities to respond to climate change and different preferences for how they respond. Nutrition is an important outcome in this framework that is affected by climate change through impacts on the availability of healthy foods, as well as the nutritional content of key crops. However, we also consider nutrition as an important resilience capacity, which influences people's ability to respond to shocks and stressors. And there's also a link between diet choices and greenhouse gas emissions. Implementing partners can support more gender equitable outcomes and increase food and nutrition security through carefully designed interventions. And these interventions can provide or scale new responses, such as new technologies or practices. And they can also build people's resilience capacities and create an enabling environment for people to cope with shocks and adapt to long-term changes. Climate-smart agriculture interventions require thinking beyond production to other nodes along agricultural value chains. Value chains provide a useful frame for thinking about how climate-smart practices can maximize nutrition entering the value chain and minimize nutrition leaving the value chain. For example, through seed and input choices, food storage and processing practices, in climate-proofing market distribution and retail, can all influence the supply of healthy foods that meet people's nutritional needs, even as each of these nodes in the value chain is affected by climate change. And we also need to think about gendered roles along value chains to ensure that both men and women are able to contribute to climate-smart agriculture and benefit from their contributions. GCAN research has highlighted the challenge of aflatoxin risks as one example where integration of gender, nutrition, and value chain thinking matters. Aflatoxin risks are increasing with climate change, and addressing these risks requires interventions during production, processing, and storage. Women play key roles in implementing these interventions and in selecting foods for household consumption that can reduce aflatoxin exposure. We'll also be applying this value chain perspective to a new GCAN study on the goat value chain in Senegal. This is a qualitative study in collaboration with ISRA that will involve focus groups and interviews with different actors along the goat value chain in 3 different areas of the country: a pastoral area, a mixed crop livestock area, and an urban market. And the goal is to identify climate risks, gendered roles and opportunities, and entry points for strengthening climate resilience, women's empowerment, and nutrition outcomes along the value chain. So stay tuned for more research from this project. Now I want to highlight what we see as some key remaining research gaps related to climate change, gender, and nutrition. One area where more evidence is needed is on the gendered impacts of climate-smart agriculture. This includes looking at how these practices and strategies affect decision-making, labor allocation, control over income and assets, and gendered livelihood roles and norms. There's some existing research, mostly in case studies, but more evidence is needed across a range of contexts. Another area of research would be to explore to what extent women's empowerment contributes to climate resilience. There's some GCAN research showing that women's empowerment is linked with crop diversification, which is an important risk mitigation strategy. But again, more research is needed in this area. This work could be expanded, for example, to look at the relationship between women's empowerment and adoption of climate-smart practices, and livelihood diversification through participation in off-farm enterprises. Another important area of research would explore what are the most effective interventions and investments that support inclusive, nutrition-sensitive, and climate-smart agriculture. And this refers to things going beyond looking at agricultural technologies to include also examining policies, services, social protection programs, and gender transformative approaches, among other things. And lastly, what do we even mean by women's climate resilience? I think we need to do more work to define the indicators for measuring various resilience capacities and outcomes and come up with a set of common indicators that we can use. So for more information on this project, you can visit the GCAN website and sign up to receive our newsletter. Thank you very much.